Zanzibar Gem. You've probably seen them before. They're quite regular in shopping centres and so forth. They do actually come in a couple of different varieties, and they're a very forgiving plant. Wonderful thing is one of the taglines is thrives on neglect. So this is one of the first plants I ever actually grew that didn't decide to die on me straight away. Its description for somebody with essentially a black thumb was perfect. So I constantly forget about my plants, but so they die. So, well, needed a plant that survived. This was it. So a couple of different varieties you can get, which I didn't know about originally, is the first one that you're probably more familiar with if you have seen them before. They've got a real nice, thick, dark, glossy leaf, which is what you usually see, because they'll grow indoors very happily. They don't need a lot of light, and if you put them in too much sun, it starts to bleach the leaves and you'll wind up with like a really light green or a yellowing happening. Another variety that I discovered quite recently is a dwarf variety. So it's basically the same as the other, but it just grows a lot smaller. Perfect for offices and so forth. So you keep it in a nice little pot, very easy to look after once again, but rather than getting this great big plant that can grow, well, I'll show you a picture later, quite large, keeps it to a much more compacted size. And then this particular one here, which I recently discovered, the leaves aren't anywhere near as thick as the other guys, but it has a much darker leaf. And from my experience so far, it also seems to be a lot happier in more light than the other two varieties. So I've got one indoors which gets almost no light, and it's got a very bright green leaf, but the ones that are getting more light have a much darker leaf. So this one definitely seems to be a lot more light friendly than the other two. So it's quite interesting. So let's show you a couple of other things. This one here is my original plant. So you can see it gets quite large. So very glossy, but it's probably getting more sun than it really should. So as you can see, the leaves are a lot lighter. It starts to turn its way away from the sun, and you can see the yellow bleaching starting to happen on the edges. So ideally I really need to move it back so it's not getting as much sun. It really needs a repot as well, which I recently tried to do, but obviously didn't do it quite well enough because it's much bigger than I was expecting. So its root system has filled up almost that entire pot. So I'll give that one a go later. And here is an example of the dwarf variety. So you see it's a much smaller plant, but it probably looks more similar to your standard variety than the other black variety, which is that one. So each of them seems to have their own little strengths and weaknesses, but the positive that all of them seem to have is that they're relatively forgiving and easy to care for, and only need rather irregular watering because they don't like wet feet at all. And they're nowhere near as finicky as the desert rose is either. So if you give them a bit too much water, as long as it drains, they're going to be okay. If you forget to water them for ages, once again, they're generally still going to be okay. Unlike your desert rose, which doesn't like wet feet but wants to be watered relatively regularly, considering. So this is the one that I showed you at the beginning of the video. I've just taken it out of its pot because it really needs repotting. The roots were starting to reach the bottom. Now here's the thing, when you want to start propagating, the easiest way, if you see that, that's the rhizome. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's the way it's written. So essentially what will happen is as it gets bigger, you'll see that that'll sort of start to split into multiples. They're kind of, if it's big enough, that you'll basically see you can actually separate them. How it actually happens under the ground, I don't know. Doesn't ultimately matter. And I also believe in the forgiving nature of the plant. You can potentially even get away with carefully cutting that, letting it dry out and heal, and then using that as well. That being said, unless you're willing to lose the plant, that's not something I would actually recommend doing, unless it's like a dire need, basically because you're going to be risking killing it anyway. But if you want to experiment, I have a sneaking suspicion that would actually work. So I've just removed one of my other Zanzibars from the pot. Here As you can see there, it's a bit thick at that spot. You can actually see the rhizome, still hope I'm pronouncing that right, it's almost separated. It's really only connected by this spot about here. Yeah, you've got that one there attached to one and the other attached to the other one. So if I want to, I can basically separate those, let it dry a bit so that it calluses over, and then basically replant them both. So that's, I think I'll actually probably do that with this one and see how that goes. In fact, each one of these are the darkest leafed ones, if you can't tell the difference just from here. Each one of these ones that I've got, I actually separated from one original. So when I first purchased it, I wound up with like 4 or 5. So that's basically doable. Sometimes you'll actually get it and it's actually, you don't end up needing to actually do anything to it damage wise. You can actually just sort of tease them apart. So I'm not sure. It may actually be that as they get older, it separates itself into a separate rhizome. So but you can break them apart as well. Just be very careful when you do it. Seal it. Okay, so I just separated them. It's nice and gentle, and it's actually only a very small break. Let's try and get a bit closer. So let's get that focus there. So it's only quite a small spot. It was a little bit damp as well, so yeah, probably would have left it to dry for a little bit anyway, so I'll repot them tomorrow instead of straight away. So when repotting them, the big thing is they like good, well-draining soil. Not as finicky as your desert roses are, but you want a good cacti and succulent mix, essentially, is generally the way to go. You can make your own if you're a bit more adventurous, but that's fine. You'll want to basically water it in nicely so that it gets around the roots properly, and then just leave it a while, let it drain out properly. They do not need a regular watering. They don't like to be wet. They store a lot of moisture. As you can see, even in this small plant, the roots are quite thick, and the rhizome itself is going to store a fair bit, and it doesn't lose a lot of water. If when you actually take it out of its original pot, it's really all wet, soggy, give it time to dry out first. Let it get nice and dry before you put it back in. Otherwise, you're going to run the risk of your root rot. They are a bit prone to that if they get too wet in particular. So that's the other thing to look out for. Other than that, they're really, really easy to look after. And as they get bigger, put them in bigger pots. They will essentially grow to the size of the pot. And here we have, nicely repotted. Just give it a bit of watering in. It's more about making sure that it settles all the soil around the roots, so that you don't wind up having it get upset or shifting later. So you've got it all sorted out, and then place it somewhere where it can nicely drain. And there you have it. That's Zanzibar Gem. The basics on care and repotting. They really don't need much at all. They're a very slow grower as well, so that's another trick. It's also one of the reasons why they tend to be pretty expensive when you buy them, because propagating them and growing them and making them a decent size takes a lot of time. But it also has the advantage that if you get a small one, it's going to take a lot of time before it gets too big for you. So there you have it. Catch you next time. Thank you.